All right, so picking back up right where we left off, wrapping up chapter 5, let's talk about our various accessory structures that assist in these functions of our skin, right? So this is not skin itself. This is the rest of our integumentary system. So hair, nails, and glands. So hair comes from hair follicles, which you could think of as just these invaginations, these folding inwards of our epidermis. You essentially see the same basic functions being reproduced within the bulb, the deepest layer of our hair follicle here, where we're going to have some basal cells that act as stem cells that's producing keratinocytes, which are going to die off and flatten and become replaced with just keratin and membrane and fat as it gets closer to the outermost layers. And you see that represented in color here. We have our base. We have that middle layer of keratinocytes replacing the cells with keratin, and then essentially dead keratinocytes all the way on the outer part and what make up a majority of our shaft, which is what you see outside of your skin. Right? All of this part is just our shaft. These are dead keratinocytes, cells that have just been fully replaced with keratin protein. So beyond our hair follicle, we have various other structures that help out or support the function of hair. We have different types of glands that can secrete directly onto that hair. We have sebaceous glands, which secrete a oily sebum. We have apocrine glands in some parts of our body, which secrete a more protein-rich type sweat, which is what leads to our own unique body odors. We have erector pili muscles, which are going to help with sensation, as well as help with our thermoregulation. These are what pull on our hair follicles, causing our hair to stand up when we're cold. And then, of course, we have our blood supply and some nerve connection to help with that sensation. So hair is structured into strata, essentially, with, like I mentioned earlier, very similar organization and difference in function as you move from the core base center towards the outer parts. So we have our medulla or our core, which is going to be mainly made up of this soft keratin. So these are the earliest parts of our keratinocytes. As it starts moving out, the cortex is mainly hard keratin, which is what we associate with that structural difference between hair and skin. Skin is mainly soft keratin. Hair and nails are mainly hard keratin. And then we have our cuticle surrounding it, which is thin but very tough keratin. So earliest immature keratinocytes filling themselves with this protein, and then we have keratinocytes with a different version of that keratin making up the cortex and the cuticle. And then at the base of your hair, right, so all of the hair that we have coming out would just be these structures you see here. This is what's making up the shaft. Right? We have a cross section here of our follicle, so we're seeing deep within our dermis what this would look like, all the structures surrounding that hair. But just these 3 layers are what make up a majority of what we see on the surface. This is our shaft made up of the cuticle, cortex, and medulla. But in our follicle, we have an internal root sheath surrounding that, an external root sheath surrounding the internal one, a glassy membrane, and then just connective tissue surrounding it. And these are all just supporting structures there to help keep that hair connected to the dermis, to help reproduce more keratinocytes and keep up the structure of the hair itself. I'm not likely to ask you very many specific questions about the structure of hair, just kind of walking through it to expose you to this knowledge, to get an idea that hair is kind of just modified skin. It's been reorganized and just packaged differently to end up producing this structure. And we get a kind of a similar thing with nails. So you can see that organization with a different cut. Instead of our cross section here, we have more of a transverse section here. So you can see our matrix, the medulla, the cortex surrounding it, the cuticle surrounding that, and then those different connective tissues and epithelial tissues that support the hair itself. This all makes up our follicle. And this follicle is deep, typically in the reticular layer or touching the subcutaneous layer within our skin. So your hair starts very, very deep. Nails are very similar as far as just being a modified version of skin showing up in specific areas. We just have nails at the tips of our fingers and tips of our toes to provide some extra protection in those places. And we can really just use this diagram to talk about it. So your nails are mainly growing from what we see the lanula here outwards, creating a majority of our nail body all the way to the free edge, which extends beyond over our dermis and no longer has that pink coloration from the blood supply. And there's no blood supply beneath that free edge to assist with that color. We have these various folds of our actual skin around that nail. So we have our lateral nail folds on the lateral portions each side. We have our proximal nail fold, which is proximal to the body. And then the eponychium is just where the proximal nail fold meets the nail, so kind of the base of our nail structure. And then a majority of the nail is just the body. And so you can see our roots going deep to that eponychium, more proximally, almost all the way to our bone, the phalanx here of our fingers. Again, not likely to be asked very specific questions about the actual structure of nails themselves. It's just a different modification on how skin is organized into mainly hard keratin to provide some extra protection at these parts of our body. All right. Glands, however, you are likely to get some specific questions about. So we have two major gland types to talk about. We have our oil glands and our sweat glands. And then under sweat glands, we have some further separation and categories to talk about. So oil glands or sebaceous glands secrete sebum, which is oil, a type of oil. Okay? And so our sebaceous glands are all over our body. Anywhere where you have hair, you are likely to have a sebaceous gland, which is going to secrete the sebum directly onto that hair. And that provides lubrication for the skin and helps with our waterproofing and maintenance of that water. It not only secretes directly onto most, if not all, of our hair cells, but you also have sebaceous glands that are secreting directly onto your skin. So that oil is helpful, and however, we use lots of products that remove that oil and then replace that oil, which is kind of a silly thing that we as humans do. But especially for places like our face, where oil is going to lead to clogging of open pores, which lead to the production of acne, which we typically don't want to have on our face. And so we use products to remove the oil that our body produces, and then different products to replace that oil to provide a different version of hydration and protection instead. Anyways, sebaceous glands secrete sebum, oil. They could do this directly onto our hairs or directly onto our skin. And the only place that you really don't find this in your body is in thick skin. And you don't want to have oil in these areas where you need friction, because that would lubricate that friction and make it hard to stick onto things. But you do get sweat glands on your thick skin. And so our fingerprint is the thin layer of sweat that you have present on those different ridges that are left behind when you touch something. So all of the grooves, they don't leave that thin layer of sweat behind. It's all the projections, the ridges that are sticking out, and thus you get your fingerprint, which is coming from sweat. So anyways, sweat glands, we could separate into apocrine or eccrine sweat glands. Eccrine is also synonymous with the term merocrine, so you'd see either of these interchangeably. So if you see reference to eccrine or merocrine glands, those are both sweat glands. And so eccrine or merocrine glands represent a majority of our sweat glands. These secrete onto the surface of our skin, basically all over our body, secreting that sweat for thermoregulation and protection. The various bacterial species that live on our skin kind of live off of that sweat and sebum. They eat both of these things to nourish themselves. And then they benefit us by killing off other invaders or producing byproducts of that metabolism that we can absorb through our skin and help us. So this is a symbiotic relationship. But the bacteria on your skin eat your sebum, eat your sweat, and help protect your body. But in some other specific areas of our body, we have specialized or modified sweat glands that we call apocrine glands. Apocrine glands typically secrete directly onto hair, and they produce a more milky, protein-rich version of sweat. And so that milky, protein-rich version of sweat is also going to be eaten by the bacteria on our skin. But the byproducts of that metabolism are more gaseous and have a smell to them. So that is what produces our own individual unique body odors. And evolutionarily, this was great for recognition of individuals, since all of our body odors smell unique to each other, as well as to signal sexual maturity, because apocrine glands do not start secreting until you are starting to until you go through puberty, until you have matured to sexual maturity. Okay, so these are not active throughout your entire life. They become active during or after puberty, and they only are found in certain areas, so in our armpits and anogenital regions. So secreting directly onto the hair in those locations, your armpit hair and pubic hair, and the hair around your anus, the anogenital regions. But apocrine glands can also be further modified into the glands that secrete earwax, our ceruminous glands, our ciliary glands of our eyelids, and our mammary glands, which secrete milk. These are all different modified versions of sweat glands, modified versions of apocrine glands. So ceruminous glands secrete earwax or cerumen into your ears for protection. Ciliary glands secrete just a different version of the sweat, a more oily version of the sweat onto our eyelids to help with this lubrication and allow our eyelids to easily open and close and protect our eyes. And then mammary glands secrete a even more protein-rich version of that apocrine sweat that we call milk. So milk is just sweat. Linger on that for a bit. And so we can take a closer look at the structure of all of these. So sebaceous glands, those oil glands, can secrete directly onto skin or onto hair. And so they end up making this branching network looking thing, right, of mainly cuboidal epithelia surrounding it. This cuboidal epithelia is mainly found in glands where you're going to have a lot of secretion. And so when you see this branching looking network, that is a sebaceous gland. Sweat glands tend to form a more spiral looking structure. So here we have a apocrine gland, which would always be secreting directly onto hair. Here we have an eccrine or American sweat gland, which looks like a bundle of yarn, right? And so when we were doing our histology lab, you likely saw some of these, or I know, looking at some of the images of tissue under the microscope, I saw multiple groups had images like this, where we had multiple open holes with cuboidal epithelia surrounding it. So we were likely looking at a cross-section or longitudinal section, no, cross-section. I guess either one would produce this. So cross-section or longitudinal section of a sweat gland. We get a bunch of open holes because these would have been tubes that would wrap around and connect with each other, secreting sweat. So these bundles of yarn looking structures are sweat glands. If it's going directly onto the skin, that's going to be eccrine. If it's going directly onto an hair, that is apocrine gland. You can see another look at that here. It looks like those little bundles. Okay, so those are our accessory structures. Hair and nails, essentially just modified versions of the strata we saw for our epidermis, just to provide some extra protection from our nails. Hair helps with thermoregulation and sensation, with erector pilae muscles pulling our hair to stand up to help with trapping heat. And we have nerve endings that directly connect to the hair follicle to help with our feeling of sensation, like you can sense things rubbing against your hair without it directly touching your epidermis. And then we have various types of glands that either secrete sweat or oil, with lots of different modifications to those sweat glands. Apocrine glands which only start secreting at puberty, modifications of those apocrine glands to make our ceruminous glands, which secrete earwax, our mammary glands, which secrete milk, and our ciliary glands, which secrete a different type of a more oily sweat for lubrication of our eyelids. So the last part of this chapter is to talk about injury and repair, right? Since our skin, our integumentary system is the major separation between us and our external environment, it is also the most susceptible to injury. And so is set up to repair itself quickly, as fast as it can, to prevent more damage to the underlying structures and to prevent invaders from getting into our body, getting into our blood, damaging the rest of our body. And so we'll talk about all of these phases, but we have our inflammatory phase, which is our immediate response, our migratory phase, as we're starting to repair and replace that tissue, proliferation phase, which is where major repair is occurring, and then scarring phase, which is kind of what we're left with at the end as collagen fibers, as the connective tissue underlying it is being remade. So immediately, our response to damage, to injury is inflammation. So mast cells near the area of injury are going to start producing a protein called histamine, which causes your blood vessels to dilate or open up, which invites, there's a specific term I was looking for there, recruits, there we go. All of our other immune response blood cell types to the area to start forming protective networks. So bringing in basophils and other, what's the term I'm looking for there? Protective immune cells that can kill off invaders, as well as bringing in our plasma, our platelets, to start forming blood clots, which will eventually stop the loss of blood to the external environment. So we want to recruit our blood cells to the area, but we don't want to have our blood leaving our body. So we need the platelets there to provide clotting and prevent that blood loss, while also bringing all of these other protective cells and structures to start with our repair, right? So injury happened, mast cells produce inflammation through the protein histamine to recruit more blood vessels, more blood cells to the area and start with our repair. So the migratory phase happens after a blood clot has been formed. So once all those platelets have started to coagulate our blood, that is what forms a scab, right? That is just coagulated blood that is hardened. And so blood is no longer leaving our body. Right? It is all now stuck beneath this. The migratory phase is when our epithelial cells, our epidermis, is starting to migrate to completely surround that clot, to completely surround that scab. So we have some of those macrophages, that's the word I was looking for, our protective cells that are going to be penetrating throughout here, trying to kill off any invaders that did get in with that injury. We have fibroblasts that are starting to produce the connective tissue networks for us, and then our epithelial cells from that basal layer are penetrating deep, migrating deep until they will completely surround this and start producing more keratinocytes, which will start to push more superficially. So essentially, macrophages are going to kill off invaders and start breaking down this coagulated blood so that the epithelial cells can start replacing that coagulated blood. So we are going to have epidermis keratinocytes replace all of this volume of coagulated blood as macrophages are destroying it. The fibroblasts are going to start creating connective tissue under that epithelia. And so essentially that's all going to start pushing more and more towards the surface, replacing the epidermis and dermis that was there before. So the proliferation phase is describing that pushing towards the surface. And so the epithelial cells migrated until they completely surrounded that scab. Macrophages are breaking down that coagulated blood. Fibroblasts are creating those collagen and elastic fiber networks. And our epithelia are starting to move more towards the surface again. And then lastly, we have our scarring phase. So when damage has occurred, a majority of the connective tissue that is being created under that under the epithelia is mainly collagen now, so more likely represents the reticular layer rather than the papillary layer. So we get a lot more collagen, or a higher density of collagen than was there previously. And if that collagen is visible from the surface, that is what produces a scar. So a visible scar is much more likely to show up if that injury is perpendicular to those tension lines rather than if it is parallel. And so that all really depends on how deep the cut was, how well our epithelia, our epidermis is able to replace itself. And so if that underlying collagen network is visible from the surface, you get a scar. But sometimes our repair mechanisms are working so well that we get an overproduction of that collagen, which pushes the epidermis into this bump, this superficial extension of the epidermis that we call a keloid. So this isn't bad. This is similar to like with vitiligo. This is mainly just a aesthetic issue because this is just your skin that has extra collagen under it. So extra dermis, more than it needs, essentially, creating that bump, right? And you get that pink coloration from the underlying blood vessels that are there. It's just a raised fibrous scar tissue, but you still have epidermis above it. So not only is our skin susceptible to physical damage, which would go through the repair that we were just discussing, but it's also susceptible to burn damage, damage from heat. Okay? And so we talk about burns as first degree, second degree, or third degree based on how deep that burn damage penetrated. So first degree burns are describing damage to just your epidermis. And since this is only damaging the epithelial cells of your skin, that damage isn't going to be very long lasting and is going to be repaired quite quickly because your epithelial cells are highly reproductive. And so a first degree burn isn't going to last very long. However, it does hurt because all of your nerve endings that are underlying it and the dermis are intact, but should be generally easy to repair. You haven't damaged any connective tissue. Most of your accessory structures should still be intact. So it's just your epithelia needing to replace themselves. So quite quick to repair. Second degree burns have penetrated deep into deeper than the epidermis and have gotten into the dermis. This is a more extensive damage since we're now damaging our connective tissue of the papillary layer. We're going to get some damage to the nerve endings and some of the accessory structures that you find in the dermis. So hair follicles and glands are going to be going to need some deeper repair. Those erector pilae muscles are going to need some more repair. So this is going to hurt more than your first degree burn and take much longer to repair. So this is where we get things like blistering showing up from that damage as well. So second degree would be the most painful and is going to require a longer time and much more structural repair than the first degree burn did. But then our deepest burn, a third degree burn, penetrates all the way through the entire cutaneous membrane. So all of our skin, from the epidermis all the way into the papillary and reticular layer of the dermis. And although this is the most extensive damage and is going to require the most repair, or in a lot of cases is impossible for the body to repair on its own, this is also likely the least painful of the three, because all of the nerve endings that were there to provide the sensation of pain have been damaged and destroyed. So a third degree burn could even go unnoticed if you weren't aware of what happened, potentially, because all those nerve endings are gone. So this is the least painful, but the most damaging and hardest to repair. This would typically require a skin graft. So the transplantation of skin to this area, the artificial repair with a doctor to that area of skin, because all of your tissue systems that were there to repair itself have been damaged, hurt, and cannot repair and replace. Those are burns. And we use this rule of 9 in medicine. And I know it's common in dermatology specifically when addressing skin, right? And the rule of 9 says separated different parts of the body as far as how much of your body's skin is in those areas. So 9% of the skin is covering the head, 9% of the skin is covering each of your upper limbs. The trunk composes, or 36% of your skin is surrounding the trunk, 1% of your genitalia, and then each of your lower limbs has 18% of your skin. And this is an average for adults. This is important in the medical field because burns that are covering more than 20% of the skin are considered life-threatening and require immediate attention. And for a child, that's going to look a bit different since your proportion of your body is different as you grow and mature. So you get a bit of separation there with those percentages. But that rule of nines could be important for medical application depending on what field you're going into. Keep that in mind. The head, 9%, each upper limb, 9%, the trunk, 36%, each of your lower limbs, 18%, and the genitalia composing 1%. And you can do the math and add all that up. I promise it adds up to 100. And that brings us to the end of chapter 5. So as always, if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. If you have questions as far as applications of this stuff, please bring those to class so that we can discuss and expand on them and maybe even learn something new together.